Somewhere in the back of your grandmother's cellar, there was probably a crock. A heavy, salt-glazed thing, maybe chipped around the rim, sitting in the dark and doing something that most people today would find almost unbelievable. It was keeping an entire garden's worth of food alive. No electricity, no pressure gauge, no processing time, just a clay vessel, some salt, and a process so old that human beings were doing it before they had writing to record it. And then one day that crock stopped being used. It got pushed to the corner, then to the barn, then it disappeared entirely, replaced by bright tin cans stacked in neat rows, by rubber-sealed mason jars rattling in a boiling water bath, by a whole new system that required equipment, instruction manuals, and a certain kind of trust in industrial expertise that people back then were just beginning to develop. Most of us never questioned that trade. Why would we? The new methods looked modern. They looked safe. And we were told in so many words that the old ways were the dangerous ones. But here is the thing that nobody really explained. The Crock method, this ancient, almost embarrassingly simple technique, has been feeding populations through winters and famines and long sea voyages for thousands of years. It kept soldiers fed and ships provisioned and families alive through months when nothing was growing. It did not require a factory. It did not require a patent. And it cost almost nothing. That last part might matter more than anything else. What we are talking about is lactofermentation. And in the time it takes you to watch this video, you are going to understand exactly why it works, exactly why the industry quietly stopped teaching it, and exactly why it is coming back in a very big way. So let's start at the beginning. What actually is the Crock method? And why does something so old still hold up? The word fermentation tends to make people nervous. It sounds like something that happens by accident, something that went wrong in the back of the refrigerator. But intentional fermentation, controlled, deliberate, practiced fermentation, is one of the oldest and most reliable food preservation technologies human beings have ever developed. We are talking about a process that predates writing, predates metal tools. In some form or another, it predates almost everything we would recognize as civilization. The Crock method specifically refers to lactofermentation. That prefix, lacto, does not mean dairy. It refers to lactic acid, which is the key player in this entire process. Here is how it works at the most basic level. Vegetables, almost any vegetable you can grow or buy, are packed into a vessel and submerged under a brine. That brine is typically nothing more than water and salt. That is it. No vinegar, no heat, no special equipment, just salt, water, and time. What happens next is the important part. Naturally occurring bacteria that already live on the surface of vegetables, bacteria called lactobacillus, begin to multiply in that salty, oxygen-free environment. As they multiply, they consume the natural sugars in the vegetables and produce lactic acid as a byproduct. That lactic acid then lowers the pH of the entire environment. And once the pH drops low enough, almost nothing harmful can survive in it. Pathogens are crowded out. Mold is suppressed. The food is preserved. The crock itself is traditionally stoneware, the heavy, dense ceramic vessel your great-grandmother probably kept in the cellar. But here is the thing that might surprise you. The vessel is almost irrelevant. People have done this in clay pots, in wooden barrels, in repurposed pickle jars. The container only needs to hold liquid, allow for some form of gas release during active fermentation, and keep the vegetables weighted below the surface of the brine. You can buy a proper fermentation crock for a few dollars at a thrift store. You can use a mason jar and a Ziploc bag filled with brine as a weight. The investment is genuinely minimal, which is part of why this technique was so universal for so long. It required nothing that ordinary people did not already have. And the results, the actual shelf life it produces, rival or exceed almost anything you can achieve with modern pressure canning. Some traditionally fermented vegetables keep for a year. some keep longer. In cool storage, this food does not just survive, it continues to improve. So, let's actually walk through what this looks like in practice. Because once you see how simple the process is, the idea that it was ever replaced by something more complicated starts to feel genuinely strange. You start with vegetables. Whatever you have in abundance, cabbage, cucumbers, carrots, green beans, radishes, you prepare them, shred them, slice them, leave them whole. Then you make your brine. Salt dissolved in water. That's it. The ratio matters. Typically somewhere around 2% salt by weight. But you're not calibrating laboratory equipment here. People have been eyeballing this for thousands of years. You pack your vegetables into your container. You pour the brine over them, or in the case of cabbage, you can draw the liquid out of the vegetable itself just by massaging salt directly into it. Then you weigh everything down so the vegetables stay submerged, and then you wait. The active fermentation phase usually runs somewhere between 3 days and 2 weeks, depending on the temperature of the room and the vegetable you're working with. During that window, the jar might bubble. You might see some cloudiness in the brine. That's not spoilage. That is the process working exactly the way it's supposed to. The lactobacillus bacteria are doing their job, converting sugars into lactic acid, dropping the pH of the brine steadily lower with each passing day. You taste it as it goes. When the flavor is where you want it, sour enough, developed enough, you move it to cold storage. A root cellar, a refrigerator, a cool basement corner. The cold slows fermentation nearly to a halt, and the food holds. The total equipment cost for a basic setup is almost nothing. A wide-mouth mason jar runs about $1 at a yard sale. A Ziploc bag filled with brine to act as a weight costs pennies. The salt itself, even bought specifically for this, runs about $3 for enough to ferment through an entire growing season. Compare that to the infrastructure modern food preservation demands. A pressure canner costs anywhere from $80 to $300. It requires a reliable heat source. It consumes energy every time you use it. It demands jars, lids, rings, consumables that add up over time. And once that food is processed in a pressure canner, it is done changing. The heat that makes it shelf-stable also destroys a significant portion of its nutritional content. Enzymes gone, many vitamins reduced. The beneficial bacteria, the live cultures that make fermented food genuinely valuable to the gut, completely eliminated. The fermented crock gives you something the canner fundamentally cannot. A living food. One that costs almost nothing to produce and almost nothing to store. The simplicity isn't a limitation. It turns out the simplicity is actually the point. So what can you actually put in that crock? The answer is going to surprise you because most people assume fermentation is just sauerkraut and pickles. And yes, cabbage and cucumbers belong there. But the method goes so much further than that. Carrots, beets, green beans, radishes, turnips, hot peppers and sweet peppers both, garlic, whole cloves, submerged in brine, turning mellow and complex over the course of a few weeks. Cauliflower florets that hold their texture in ways that canned cauliflower never could. Winter squash, kohlrabi, even tomatoes, green ones especially, which ferment beautifully and taste nothing like the jarred versions sitting on grocery store shelves. A serious homesteader working a modest garden plot can ferment the bulk of a fall harvest using nothing more than a handful of crocks or wide-mouth jars, some non-iodized salt, and a cool corner of the basement. No processing days, no racing against the clock before the lids seal. You pack the vegetables, you mix the brine, you weigh everything down below the surface, and then you wait. The crock does the rest. And here's where it gets genuinely impressive. Properly fermented vegetables stored at cellar temperatures, somewhere between 50 and 60 degrees, don't just last a few weeks, they last months. Traditional sauerkraut kept in cool storage has been documented holding its quality well past the 6-month mark. Some preparations go longer. Before mechanical refrigeration existed, This was how entire communities made it through winter, not as a novelty, as a survival strategy. What's more, the food actually improves during storage. The flavor deepens. The beneficial bacteria population stabilizes and matures. The texture, depending on the vegetable, holds in ways that heat-processed food simply cannot replicate. A fermented green bean after 3 months in the crock still has a snap to it. The canned version gave that up the moment it hit boiling water. There's also the variety question. Canning tends to push people toward processing one thing at a time, in large batches, because the effort demands it. But fermentation is flexible. You can add a small handful of peppers to one jar, a few extra cloves of garlic to another. You can combine vegetables. Classic mixed ferments have been a staple across Eastern Europe and Asia for centuries. The crock accommodates whatever the garden is producing right now, in whatever quantity you have on hand. The result is a preserved pantry that's genuinely diverse, genuinely alive, and built on almost nothing in terms of financial investment. Which raises the obvious question. If the method works this well, why did so many people stop using it? The answer to that question didn't happen overnight. It happened gradually, and it happened the way most cultural shifts happen. Not through force, but through convenience, through marketing, through a slow, systematic replacement of one way of doing things with another that happened to make certain people a great deal of money. By the late 1800s, commercial canning was already underway in the United States. The Civil War had accelerated it. Armies needed to feed soldiers at scale, and sealed tins of preserved food solved a very real logistical problem. After the war ended, the infrastructure didn't disappear. It expanded. Factories that had been producing rations for troops turned toward the civilian market, and they brought something with them that the crock had never needed: a sales pitch. The canning industry that emerged in the early 20th century wasn't just selling food, it was selling an idea. The idea that modern preservation was safer, cleaner, and more reliable than what your grandmother had been doing in the cellar. And to make that idea stick, they needed people to be at least a little bit afraid of the old methods. Some of that fear was legitimate. Botulism was a real and documented danger, and it was associated, in public health communications of the era, with improperly preserved foods. The critical nuance, was that botulism is an anaerobic bacterium. It thrives in low-acid, low-oxygen environments. Properly fermented vegetables, swimming in brine acidified by their own lactobacillus cultures, are almost the last place botulism can survive. The science was clear on this even then. But the messaging wasn't. The messaging bundled all home preservation together into a single category of risk, and then offered a solution: the commercially canned product. Inspected, standardized, safe. By the time the Great Depression had passed and the post-war consumer economy was fully underway, home economics curricula in schools across the country were teaching water bath canning as the modern method. Extension services distributed canning guides. Manufacturers sold pressure cookers and jar lids and instructional booklets. An entire ecosystem of products grew up around the process. The crock, which required almost nothing to purchase and very little to learn, didn't have a supply chain behind it. Nobody profited from salt in a clay pot. That's not a conspiracy. It's just economics. Industries invest in the methods that generate revenue, and they educate consumers accordingly. What you learn to do is often shaped, in ways that aren't always visible, by what someone else needs you to buy. The result, across roughly 3 generations, was a near-total disappearance of fermentation knowledge from mainstream American food culture. People who had grown up watching parents and grandparents manage crocks in the root cellar raised children who never learned the method. And those children raised the generation that started buying probiotics in capsule form at the pharmacy, paying premium prices to get back something their great-grandparents had produced automatically, as a byproduct of simply preserving the harvest. The knowledge didn't vanish completely. It survived in pockets. in immigrant communities that never fully abandoned their traditional foods, in rural homesteads where continuity of practice outlasted the marketing campaigns, and quietly, in a small number of research kitchens and academic papers where the science of fermentation kept being confirmed, even as the cultural memory of it faded. Here's the thing about lacto-fermentation being labeled dangerous. The timing is worth paying attention to. For most of recorded human history, fermented foods were not considered a risk. They were considered a solution. Cultures on every continent had independently discovered that salt, vegetables, and thyme produced food that lasted, food that was safe, food that in many cases was more digestible than what you'd started with. Roman soldiers carried fermented fish sauce. Korean families built underground storage systems, specifically to maintain the right temperature for fermenting kimchi through winter. Eastern European peasants survived famines partly because their root cellars held crocks of preserved cabbage that would last through the coldest months without spoiling. Nobody was calling it risky then. Nobody needed a warning label on a clay pot. The shift in perception came in the 20th century, and it didn't happen by accident. What happened was that food safety, as a concept, became industrialized. Government agencies developed frameworks for evaluating preservation methods, and those frameworks were built largely around the methods the food industry was already using. High heat, sealed containers, measurable, controllable, standardized processes. Lacto-fermentation didn't fit cleanly into that framework. It isn't a single fixed process. The variables shift depending on temperature, salt concentration, the specific vegetables involved, even the ambient microbial environment of your kitchen. That variability made it difficult to standardize. And what was difficult to standardize was, by the logic of industrial food safety, inherently suspect. There was also a genuine moment of scientific confusion in the early 20th century that got exploited in ways that outlasted the actual confusion. Botulism was being studied and understood during roughly the same period that modern canning was being developed. The fear around improper preservation was real. Improperly home-canned, low-acid foods can and do produce botulinum toxin. That's true, but lacto-fermentation is a fundamentally different process. The acidic environment produced by fermentation is actively hostile to Clostridium botulinum. The mechanism that makes canning dangerous when done incorrectly is not present in a properly salted ferment. The bacteria that cause the problem cannot survive the environment that fermentation creates. That distinction, clear in the science, available to anyone willing to read the research, didn't make it into the public conversation. What made it into the public conversation was a general anxiety about home preservation, an anxiety that conveniently redirected people toward professionally processed food and commercially approved equipment. The message, stated or implied, was that food safety was complicated, that ordinary people couldn't be trusted to get it right without proper tools, and that the safest thing to do was leave it to the professionals. The science didn't actually support that conclusion, but the science wasn't writing the cookbooks or setting the curriculum for home economics classes. Industry messaging was, and it turns out you don't need to suppress a fact to make it disappear. You just need to make sure nobody thinks to ask the question in the first place. But people started asking the question again. It didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen because of any single person or movement. It happened the way most quiet revolutions happen. Gradually, in kitchens and basements and back gardens, among people who were tired of paying for convenience and suspicious of a food system that seemed increasingly disconnected from anything they recognized as real. The homesteading revival of the early 2000s brought the crock back into circulation almost by accident. People learning to keep chickens and grow kitchen gardens started running into the same problem every generation before them had faced. What do you do with 40 pounds of cabbage in October? The internet, for all its noise, turned out to be genuinely useful here. Old-timers who remembered their grandmother's crocks found forums where the information they carried was suddenly in demand. Recipes that hadn't been written down in decades got transcribed and shared and tested by thousands of people. Simultaneously, Then the researchers caught up. Or rather, they started publishing what they had already known in places where non-specialists could find it. The work of food scientists like Sandor Katz, whose writing on fermentation brought rigorous curiosity to a subject that had been treated as fringe, helped establish a vocabulary for talking about lactofermentation that was neither mystical nor corporate. It was just accurate. The microbiology was real, the safety record was real, and the nutritional benefits, live cultures, bioavailable vitamins, enhanced digestibility, turned out to be increasingly well supported by peer-reviewed literature. Chefs started paying attention around the same time. Fermented foods had never disappeared from professional kitchens in Korea, Japan, Eastern Europe, Scandinavia. But they began showing up in fine dining restaurants in ways that made American and Western European audiences encounter them as sophisticated rather than primitive. Kimchi appeared on tasting menus. Fermented hot sauces developed cult followings. Sourdough, which is simply fermentation applied to bread, became something people took serious pride in during a period when the entire country was suddenly home a lot more than usual. What all of these threads had in common was that ordinary people, given access to clear information, turned out to be entirely capable of making smart decisions about fermentation. The learning curve was shallow. The failure rate was low. The results were, by most accounts, genuinely delicious. The anxiety that had been sold to previous generations, the idea that preservation without professional equipment was inherently reckless, collapsed the moment people actually tried it. The crock wasn't dangerous. It was just inconvenient for anyone trying to sell you something. So here you are. You've heard the history. You know why it disappeared. And you know why that disappearance had more to do with market share than with your safety. The question now is what you actually do with that information. The answer is simpler than you might expect. You start small. You find a crock, or a mason jar, or any clean vessel that can hold brine and weight. You buy a head of cabbage. You add salt. That's it. That's the entry point. The whole system, the one that fed families through winters for centuries, begins exactly there. You don't need a certification. You don't need a pressure canner that costs more than a car payment. You don't need to watch your grandmother do it first. Though if you have someone like that in your life, call her, because she almost certainly remembers something worth knowing. What you do need is the willingness to trust a process that is, when you look at it honestly, more reliable than most things we've handed over to industrial systems. Lactofermentation has a track record measured in millennia. The vegetables you pack into brine this fall will tell you clearly if something has gone wrong. The smell, the color, the texture, in ways that a sealed tin never could. And beyond the practical, there is something else. Something that's harder to quantify, but that people who start doing this almost universally describe. It is the feeling of being less dependent, of watching a shelf fill up with food you made, food that is alive in the oldest sense of the word, food that will keep without electricity, without vacuum seals, without anyone's permission. The canning industry spent decades convincing you that you needed them. You never did. The crock was always there. It's still waiting.